Thanks to YouTube restrictions, or maybe because I don't know what I'm doing, I'm going to need to split up the discussion of the big picture context of the Bible into two parts. So, here's part one. The Bible. Today we're talking about context. Context is how we know what something means. It situates words in a sentence, it puts sentences in a paragraph, it puts paragraphs in a chapter, it puts chapters in a book. You get where I'm going with this. It gives words meaning. A person, for example, can be cool or hot or sick or fat, and that can mean very different things depending on the decade in which you use it. If I were to tell you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, if you live in the United States, you probably understand what that means. If you don't, it might be a struggle to see what the point is I'm trying to make. The Bible was written in a cultural and historical context. If we don't place it accurately there, we're going to have a very hard time understanding how to read it well. We want to know what the original audience understood the text to be saying. This means knowing the common background stories that God used to convey his message to them. It means knowing common cultural understandings of how the world worked that God used to convey his message. It means figuring out what images they use that God uses to load with images of his glory. It means learning how to understand, at least to some degree, how the Hebrew language works. The Hebrew language is beautiful, but if we don't have any idea about the writing style or the nuances of the word or the kind of shared hyperlinks that the original Hebrew audience would have connected as they heard different stories or different words used, we're going to get lost pretty quickly. So here's a story from Genesis to the Gospels. I'm going to try to explain some of those hyperlinks and add the words so that there's an understanding of the different images and connections that were being made. This will be a zooming out of the big picture of the Bible from creation to Jesus before we take some future posts to zoom in. This is going to take a while, so stick with me. All right, let's do some history. In the beginning, or so the ancient Near East text read, a god, some gods, rose from primeval waters and they birthed the universe. Who these gods were didn't matter, and how that was even possible didn't matter. It just happened. And then that God faded mostly into obscurity, uncaring and uninvolved. The cosmos they created was not a pleasant place. It was formless and void, unordered, birthed in the chaotic conflict of the darkness and the deep, if it had a beginning at all. Finally, the gods fought a long battle with the forces of chaos. Marduk and Baal battled with the monstrous Tiamat and Yam, and fortunately, the gods won. These gods began to name things, which in the ancient Near East was associated with creation. To them, something began to exist when it had an identity, and this identity was captured in a name, not merely in it having a form. These early civilizations explained this cosmic battle with important imagery. Darkness, the deep, the sea, the desert wasteland. These were the homes of chaos, the places of Leviathan and Behemoth and Rahab, where sea monsters, dragons, serpents, and the wandering souls of the dead lived, and even most importantly, owls. Important boundaries kept this disorder from overrunning order. Order was a sign that a god was near. The sun, for example, had an ordered schedule, so there must be a god behind it. Well, the gods got tired and needy, so they created humanity begrudgingly so that they could serve the gods as slaves. Somebody had to feed and take care of them while they kept order. However, the gods only kept order in the realm above, that is, the sky. They expected the humans to bring order to earthly chaos. So people built cities with walls to separate civilization from the wastelands. They channeled the water. They used light to keep back the night. They formed governments. They built sacred spaces with temples and gardens so that the gods could come near and be fed and be pampered. So their gods inhabited the idols that they made, which is why the people would wash, feed, and even put the idols to bed. They even tried court cases in front of one of the idols that was literally enthroned. And granted, the priests had to pull off some trickery with the food and the speech, but that too was proper service to their god. These gods were not better than people, by the way. They were just stronger. They raised no moral bar. They made mistakes. They committed crimes. They did it freely. Any ideas of goodness, justice, love, or mercy were, in the end, no greater than the people who thought about them. The people had to figure out what they thought those words even meant, and then they would apply that standard to the gods. History records a sense of despair among the ancients. They hoped the gods would be just, wise, good, gracious, and faithful. They hoped they would act in those ways. They often didn't. The writers of the Bible grew up in this world, and it's fascinating to see how they used the images and ideas that formed their cultures to tell a new kind of story, this time a true story, that transformed the world. The general consensus is that Moses was either the writer and the editor or compiler of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Perhaps he was a bit of both. Moses was raised and trained by the Egyptians, and the children of Israel had been thoroughly immersed in the ancient Near East worldview. Now they have a history that diverges geographically and spiritually from this shared beginning. But since they have a shared beginning, it should be no surprise that they share stories of events that really happened. Moses uses the language, images, and themes of those shared stories to unveil the true history and the true God of the world. So in the beginning, God began to create. When God identified himself to Moses as the I Am, he was saying, among other things, that he is the one who causes things to be. He separated things in the void. He established boundaries. See the first 3 days of creation in Genesis 1. His spirit fluttered over the water like a dove, or so the rabbis translated it. This God did not arise from the darkness of the deep. He made them, and he ordered them. This God didn't do battle with monstrous titans of chaos who threatened to overwhelm him. They were nothing compared to him. He named things that were formless. That is, he established their identity and their purpose. See the last 3 days of the creation account. He raised humanity from the dirt. He gave Adam a name, Adam, which means earth, and then designed him to create with Eve, which he gave the name to give life. People had value because God created them to carry the image of God. So in the ancient world, it was rulers, emperors, and pharaohs who were held to be in the image of God. What Genesis was saying was that we're all royalty. God created humanity to enjoy this creation and their creator, not just feed and pamper some needy gods. This God, Yahweh, he was the one true God. He didn't need any help. So people were icons and representatives of God, and they were royal priestly stewards of his creation, which was an honored position in any ancient Near East culture. See, I Am means more than just the one who caused things to be. This was not an impersonal, aloof God who got things started and then left. The Hebrew word for I Am is situated within ancient languages in such a way that it suggests he is a God who enters into relationships. That too is a thing he creates. So God makes a sacred space, a temple if you will, in a sacred garden in the land of Eden. It was everything people should have wanted. It was an ordered and complete world in a space where God walked and talked with them. He did not inhabit it in the form of an idol. In fact, the psalmist would later say that God was enthroned on or inhabited the praises of his people. God made a covenant with Adam. Be faithful. You'll flourish in this good world. Be unfaithful. You'll reap toil and pain from the chaos that you sow. Nothing in this space was off limits except for one thing, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's the knowledge of those who have the right to declare good order and right boundaries for the world. This tree wasn't inherently bad. After all, it was part of God's good creation. Clearly, God had this knowledge. God had just said, it's not meant for you. This is my territory. If you claim ownership of that, chaos will follow because the boundaries of good and evil are not yours to decide. The biblical writers then record that a serpentine creature of chaos, a beast of the field, slithered into the garden. It was a crafty tester, challenging order with disorder. Eve saw something beautiful but forbidden, and we're going to come back to these words later. Saw is a particular Hebrew word, as is beautiful. And she and Adam welcomed it. Instead of having dominion over the animals, they gave up their dominion to the animal. It didn't go well. First, they hid in shame. Then, in the first act of violence recorded in the Bible, an animal died to cover their shame. The wages of chaos is death. We've known this since the beginning. It's a hard lesson to learn, but one that we easily forget. So God unveiled the path they'd chosen. They were given the image of God. They had chosen to associate with the image of the beast. Now all that was made good would be haunted by pain, chaos, and disorder. Humanity and the serpents, stewards of order, creatures of chaos, will painfully struggle over and over. Soon the Bible first uses a word we translate as sin to describe how Cain had chaos and disorder crouching at the door of his life. The next several chapters of Genesis follow this pattern. People headed east of Eden, a direction we will see over and over to represent a direction that takes people away from God. Everybody kept making things worse. When people built cities to put walls between the dark deserts of chaos, the cities were worse than the barrens. The serpent bites their heel and causes them to stumble, even as they bruise its head and chase it away. Over and over. If the behavior of Adam and Eve is any indication of how humanity would choose to live, their descendants may well have welcomed these sin serpents before realizing what they even were. Or they may have actually known. Surely the story had been passed down to them. They may have still found it intriguing and seductive. Until they didn't, and we'll see that as this story unfolds. But echoes of the deep resided in them. Chaos was still in their hearts. Sin was walking over the doorway and into the house. All the ancients recorded a flood in which the gods judged the unboundaried people by removing the boundaries around them. The people wanted to set their own boundaries, which was none, so the gods gave them a world in which they got what they wanted. However, a select group was set aside to try again. The Hebrew writers agree with the basic plot line. It was a shared historical event, after all. But they record more. Yahweh is God. He warned and waited for decades. After God washed the disorder and sin from the world, it's a symbolic return to the point in the creation narrative in Genesis 1 when there was no dry land. We read a second creation narrative. The winds blow over the earth. The waters subside, much like the Spirit of God moving over the face of the waters. God set up a new Eden with a new Adam, that's Noah, who had been saved in an ark. There was a reminder that the beast would fear them. That order, that is the seasons, would continue. They were to continue the be fruitful and multiply mandate given to Adam and Eve. This is all surrounded by a new covenant for all of humanity made with Noah. This is Eden 2.0. Well, Noah didn't improve on Adam's failure. He and his children promptly brought more disorder and sin. His descendants moved even further east to Babel, or Babylon, where they soon pursued their own version of the knowledge of good and evil, this time making a name for themselves instead of allowing God to name them and identify them and order the lives of his image-bearing stewards. So God steps in again to recreate. Unlike the Mesopotamian gods, he would not stay aloof. This God would continuously descend to his creation and serve them. He selected Abraham, who would be fruitful and multiply by being a father to many nations. He sent him to the Jordan Valley, which was watered like the garden of the Lord. It's Eden 3.0. God made a covenant with Abraham that all of the world would be blessed through Abraham's descendants. Abraham slaughtered animals in the classic suzerain covenant ritual. God's Spirit, represented by a blazing torch, moved through the middle of these pieces, in essence saying, if either one of us breaks this treaty, may it be done to me and me alone what was done to these animals. It was unheard of for the stronger party to take upon himself the weight of the penalty. Abraham was good with that kind of unconditional promise. But while God would never break the covenant, Abraham and his descendants would. They were tasked with some conditions: be inwardly blameless, be outwardly circumcised, which was a common custom that was a mark of initiation. Being blameless was bound to be too much. A few of Abraham's children, the children of his disobedience, head east yet again. Fast forward to Egypt, where captivity and slavery threatened to overwhelm them in a new kind of flood. The Bible uses words of chaos again. The Egyptians, according to Psalm 74, are sea monsters and Leviathan. When Aaron and Pharaoh's magicians have a battle pitting their gods against each other, their staffs become tannin or dragons. The plagues, which were basically a methodical smackdown of the Egyptian gods, end with a deep darkness that threatens to visit death on every family in Egypt. But God provides another ark for his people, another way out, a precious lamb whose costly death and spilled blood protected them as death passed them by.